It was December 11th, 1941, and Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag to declare war on the United States. Most people believe America dragged itself into the European war. It didn't happen that way. Hitler pulled the trigger himself, and nobody forced his hand. Stick around, because what happens next reveals one of the strangest miscalculations in modern history. A choice that may have cost Germany the entire war before American troops ever set foot on European soil. Before we get into it, ask yourself this. If you were in Hitler's position, bound by a shaky alliance with a country thousands of miles away, would you have made the same call? Drop your answer, because by the end of this you might change your mind. Pearl Harbor changed everything in a single morning. Ships burned in the harbor, thousands of sailors were gone, and a nation that had spent 2 years insisting it wanted no part of a foreign war suddenly found itself furious and united. Newspapers ran extra editions within hours. Recruitment offices saw lines stretching around city blocks by sunrise. The shock wasn't just military, it was emotional, a wound that turned isolationism into resolve almost overnight. Franklin Roosevelt stepped to the podium the next day and delivered 6 minutes that reshaped the century. He called December 7th a date that would live in infamy, and Congress declared war on Japan within the hour. But listen closely to what that speech didn't include. There was no mention of Germany, no mention of Hitler, no declaration against the Nazi regime at all. Roosevelt was fighting a one-front war on paper, even though the world was already tangled in something much bigger. What's rarely discussed is how differently the war might have unfolded had Hitler simply said nothing. Roosevelt would have faced a divided Congress, a public still hesitant about Europe, and possibly months of political maneuvering before any declaration against Germany could pass. That delay could have changed the timeline of Lend-Lease, the North African campaign, and even the eventual D-Day invasion itself. Instead, one impulsive speech in Berlin erased all of that uncertainty in a single stroke. Hitler handed Roosevelt the exact political weapon he needed, wrapped it in a declaration of war, and delivered it without being asked. It remains one of history's clearest examples of a leader defeating himself before the enemy even had to try. That single choice on December 11th didn't just widen the war, it arguably decided it, years before the guns fell silent in Europe. So next time someone tells you the United States was dragged into the European war, remember it the other way around. Hitler is the one who opened that door, standing in front of his own parliament, declaring war on a country that hadn't even decided whether to fight him yet. It wasn't inevitability. It was a choice, made in anger, made in miscalculation, and made in about 6 minutes of rambling grievance that changed the outcome of the 20th century. The lesson underneath all of it is bigger than one speech in Berlin. Sometimes the most consequential mistakes in history aren't the dramatic ones on the battlefield. They're the quiet, unforced decisions made behind closed doors, decisions nobody has to make at all. Keep that in mind next time you're facing a choice where waiting costs you nothing and acting costs you everything. If this pulled back a layer of history you thought you already understood, there's another story just like it waiting in the next video. One where a single overlooked decision quietly rewrote the outcome of a war everyone thought was already decided. Why? In London, Winston Churchill received the news privately and later admitted his relief was overwhelming. He understood immediately what it meant, that America's full industrial and military weight would now be pointed at Germany, not just Japan. He reportedly said he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved, knowing the eventual outcome of the war had just shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, hit subscribe, because the story only gets stranger from here. Within weeks, German submarines launched Operation Drumbeat off the American coastline, sinking merchant ships within sight of beaches in Florida and North Carolina. Coastal towns kept their lights on at night, unknowingly silhouetting tankers for German U-boats waiting offshore. It took months for the U.S. Navy to organize convoys and blackout protocols, and by the time it did, hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors had already been lost. That early chaos forced a strategic reckoning inside Washington and London. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed on what became known as the Europe First policy, prioritizing the defeat of Germany even though it was Japan that had struck first. It was a deeply controversial call at home, where public rage was aimed squarely at Tokyo, Yet military planners understood Germany posed the far greater long-term threat to global stability. Japan, for its part, hadn't asked Hitler to make this move either. Tokyo's leadership had deliberately avoided informing Germany of the exact timing of the Pearl Harbor attack, and some historians argue Japan expected Germany to stay neutral toward America, preserving at least one front where the axis wouldn't be stretched thin against the world's largest industrial economy. Today, historians still argue over whether Hitler's declaration was inevitable or purely self-inflicted. Some claim war with America was coming regardless, given Germany's aggressive U-boat campaign already sinking American ships in the Atlantic. Others insist Hitler had every opportunity to wait, let Roosevelt struggle for congressional support against Germany, and instead chose ego over strategy in a single afternoon. That belief turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Hitler viewed the United States as a soft, disorganized commercial nation, incapable of fighting a real war on two fronts. He didn't grasp that American factories could retool from making cars to making tanks in a matter of months, or that the country's population and resource base dwarfed anything Germany could match in a prolonged fight. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin was watching closely. The declaration meant Lend-Lease aid, already flowing to Britain and the Soviet Union, now had full political cover to expand dramatically. American factories didn't just need to arm one ally anymore. They were now officially arming a global coalition against a common enemy, with Congress fully behind it. Back home, the American mood shifted instantly. Overnight, isolationist voices that had dominated newspapers for 2 years went silent. Support for entering the European war, which had hovered around uncertain territory for months, became near unanimous within days. Hitler had done what Roosevelt's own advisors couldn't manage. He'd unified an entire country behind a war most Americans had been trying to avoid. That unity came with an enormous cost attached. The United States was now committed to fighting 2 wars on opposite sides of the planet, against Japan in the Pacific and Germany in Europe, with a military that had only just started expanding from peacetime size. It was an enormous gamble that could easily have overextended American forces on both fronts simultaneously. That gap is where the real story hides. For 4 days, the United States was formally only at war with Japan. Roosevelt knew Germany posed the greater long-term threat, but he had no legal path to declare war on a nation that hadn't attacked American soil or ships. Public opinion was still split on Europe. Roosevelt needed a reason, and remarkably, his enemy was about to hand him one. On December 11th, Hitler walked into the Reichstag and gave a rambling, grievance-filled speech blaming Roosevelt personally for provoking conflict, then declared war on the United States. Nobody in Washington asked for it. Nobody expected it. Historians still call it one of the most consequential unforced errors of the 20th century because it solved Roosevelt's entire problem in one afternoon. Why would Hitler do this? Technically, he was honoring the Tripartite Pact, the alliance binding Germany, Italy, and Japan. But the pact only obligated Germany to help if Japan was attacked first, not if Japan itself started the war by striking Pearl Harbor. Hitler wasn't legally required to declare anything. He chose to. His actual speech that day revealed more ego than strategy. He accused Roosevelt of economic sabotage, of secretly funding Britain, of personally orchestrating a war against Germany for years. It read less like a calculated military decision and more like a leader settling a personal grudge, dressed up as global politics. Behind the scenes, the reaction inside Hitler's own circle was uneasy. Foreign Minister Ribbentrop reportedly urged caution, worried about dragging Germany into a fight against an industrial giant with oceans of untapped resources. Hitler brushed the concerns aside. He believed the war would be decided in Europe long before American factories could matter.